Mexico has just elected a new president.
Very first female president, Claudia Scheinbaum.
President-elect Claudia Scheinbaum.
The country's historic new president-elect, Claudia Scheinbaum.
A moment of many firsts for Mexico. The country has elected its first female president and first president with Jewish heritage.
Some are calling it a nightmare for conservatives. I'm going to give you my thoughts on how to live in and how to invest in Mexico in the next 6 years with this new president. I've been here in Cairo for the last few days. We're working on an R&D project with Egyptian real estate and citizenship, and you'll be seeing some of that in the next couple months to come. But I was talking to my colleague here at Nomad Capitalist about the election of Mexico's upcoming new president. He calls it a nightmare for conservatives. He makes the general observations: the first female president, first Jewish president in Mexican history. She is the left-wing president-elect and mentee of AMLO, who is currently in charge, has an academic background in environmental engineering and alternative energy. And so he thinks you're going to see more Green New Deal style regulations, which could make it more costly to do business there. Here's what she has promised on economic and trade policy: expanding aggressively social welfare spending, mainly healthcare and education. That could not be so good. Pledges to uphold the free trade agreement within North America, but believes Mexican trade policies should not focus on exclusively on the USA. You've heard us say that in the past. Yes, I believe part of the reason why Mexico has been interesting to me as not an on-the-ground investment perhaps, but having interest in Mexican companies is they are already doing business with more places around the world. You're seeing nearshoring, and we'll talk about this in a moment, but you are going to see more business from all around the world. Mexico is a big country, and I was talking to folks 10, 11 years ago. Why do they let the U.S. push them around so much? That seems positive to me. Let's see what she does with it. Pledges to increase wages significantly. I don't imagine that's going to entirely be based on free market principles. I hope that people's wages increase, but let's see how she does that. Pledges to fund the transition to renewable energy. She's criticized market economics. Obviously, that is not so good. Blames neoliberal economic policies for poverty and inequality. Not so good. Wants a bigger, larger, and more interventionist government economic policy with increased government spending and taxes on the wealthy. He surmises usually follow thereafter. So a lot of good, a lot of bad, a couple things that could be good. Wants to deepen relationships with Central and South America. Again, I think being more of a global-minded country is good. And then there's some of the more liberal social policies. You might like that. You might not. I'm going to go through living in Mexico, what this might means for residence permits, if you live there part-time, if you live there full-time as a foreigner, what this means for citizenship, what this means for real estate investment. And then I'm going to talk about what I talked about recently, which is why I'm investing in Mexico with a focus more on stocks and a focus more on the Mexican peso. Long-term, my belief is that Mexico has potential if you focus more on individual investments in companies that you know something about rather than an index. I'm not going to give you specific stock recommendations, but in emerging markets, when you buy an index fund, you're often overweight on things that may be slower growth. And when you make more localized investments, whether it's you're picking your own stocks and trading those at international brokerage account, whether you have access to investments through a foreign bank that's in the region, you will, generally speaking, do better. So the U.S. next door has problems, and it's trending down. We've talked about that from day one here. Mexico has its problems, always has. AMLO's been in charge for almost 6 years now. He wasn't ideal. I'll come back to him in a minute. I think the country's trending up. I am a momentum thinker. If your business makes less money every month than the month before, you can reasonably think you're going to keep making less money. You've got a problem to fix. I think Mexico is trending on the way up. Will this election of this president stop that? I think there's a number of factors in favor of Mexico. And here's how I look at it. If you're an American and you've bought stocks during the Joe Biden administration or the Obama administration, people talk about how they destroyed the country. That's really not much different than saying, hey, I don't like the president of Mexico, I'm not going to buy Mexican stocks. And if you look at, I may not agree with Warren Buffett on everything, But he believes that the U.S. economy will always be trending in the right direction. I don't agree with him on that. But based on him thinking that, he continues to invest in the U.S., whether he likes the president or not. He's certainly more liberal than I am, or left-wing than I am on fiscal policy. But if you're an American and buying stocks under Joe Biden, and you think Joe Biden's doing a terrible job and doing some of these same things, then what's the difference other than maybe you understand the U.S. better than Mexico? So let's get into the two parts. If you are someone who's looking at living in Mexico and wondering what this new president will mean for you, we'll get into that into a minute. I always love comments like this one. LMFAO. Mexican stocks get crushed due to leftist communists winning the presidency. Guys, if you have to say LMAO or LMFAO or any of this, we get it. You're deeply wounded. You need to try and take some of the stink off by making yourself seem more secure. We all see right through it. We see it as the desperate ploy that it is for you to try and look strong and tough, even though deep inside you're like, oh, I'm going to get him so I can feel better about myself. But here's what happened. Some stocks, many stocks in Mexico, the day of this election were down, or the day after the election, were down 10%. I only own a handful of Mexico stocks. One of the stocks that I invested in was actually up. It's a packaged, consumer goods, consumer products company. It was up less than 1%, but it was up. And since the election, it's up, I think, about 7%. The time you're watching this, it may be a little bit different, but it is up. It never really went down. Bank stocks got crushed, and so we'll see what she'll do with that industry. But one of the bank stocks that I have, was down 10%, and that kind of put me back to where I started. But then it came, you saw a 3% jump, 4% jump, 1% jump. So you saw people buying. And I generally like to take my advice. I am not a professional investor. I'm someone who looks at trends. I want to see where the world is going. And I invest for 10, 20, 50 years into the future. I'm not a meme stock trader. I don't think you can call someone who buys meme stocks an investor. Doesn't mean there's anything wrong with that, but you're trading. You're not investing. I'm looking at where the future is. And listen, on Mexico, I may be proven wrong. We all know Latin America's a history. As one person said, when things get too good, they bring in someone that's very left-wing to, potentially try and ruin that. That to me is baked in. My point on following people who are more successful than I am, Bill Ackman said it pretty clearly. You may or may not agree with his more political stance recently, but he said, listen, you want your stocks to go down. I get it. Same like everybody else. It's nice to go and look at, I made some money in the stock market today. But he says, if you're my age or many of our ages, you want your stocks to go down. Why? Because you can buy more. And so I didn't have the chance to do a lot of that, but I got to do a little bit of that when something was down 10%, and now it's, maybe it's down 3% since then. I'm not buying stuff for selling it next month. I'm buying stuff because I think, and I said this, if I were to have a child, I'd rather they be Mexican than American. I think 18 years from now, the momentum, curve will be far more visible between Mexico and the U.S. They will be much closer. So Mexico is a large country. They have resources. I see the trends towards nearshoring. If the free trade agreement is upheld, that could be good. Investment from Asia is increasing, opening up beyond the USA. I think all that stuff is good. By the way, I own stocks in countries that I absolutely would have no kind of business of my own, like in France. I have one of my best performing financial services stocks is a French company. I bought it several years ago. It's outperformed U.S. banks. It's outperformed a lot of financial services companies around the world. Pays one of the healthiest dividends in that space that there is. Would I start a business in France? Would I move to France? Absolutely not. We've been very clear on my thoughts on France. But my exposure to all that icky stuff in France is limited to, hey, here's a company who knows how to navigate that. They're still profitable. The stock goes up. They pay me a dividend, and it's done well. And so I think Mexico has more room to grow than France. And so, if the policies in Mexico become as bad as the ones in France, where you can never fire anybody, just all the kind of stuff that maybe this new president-elect's talking about, does that mean the end of those companies? I'm not so sure. Let me be clear. It may not work out as well as I think in Mexico. There could always be that risk. I think that, like anybody, I have a portfolio where a lot of stocks are up and a handful of stocks are down. and sometimes you cut the losers. But my thought again remains macro. It remains multi-decades long. And again, I look at if you would buy stuff in the U.S., if you would buy a global index fund that had exposure to France, Germany's not that much better. They have some of the same policies. But I may not agree with the new president-elect. I would not, and let's get to this part. I'm not saying this is a good time to go and start a business in Mexico, but I can buy shares of other people's businesses. And because this is Nomad Capitalist and we talk about global diversification, we're talking about less than 1% of my net worth. So no matter what happens, it's not going to be the end of the world. The peso did go down. Great. If you believe in the story long term, buy more pesos. The peso is still, stronger than where it was. Let's look at the chart. Not that long ago. If you look at how the peso was done since the pandemic, it's still done very well. So, I don't necessarily look at these day-to-day things. Is the president-elect someone that aligns with my values? Most of the time, not. So let's talk about living. And we talked within my team, again, with the folks in Latin America, what they think could happen. Tax increases could come. Is that going to be great news for corporations? No, not necessarily. And that could hurt, some growth or some reinvestment prospects. Maybe a dividend gets cut somewhere. But Mexico has always had this weird tax system where if you're a foreigner, let's say you have a residence permit. Lots of people that we work with as clients choose to get Mexico residence permits. They may just keep it in their back pocket and really not spend any time at all there. Or they may go and spend part of their year there. But those who have talked about spending the majority of their time there, the question has been there's different ties that if you can avoid those, you may be able to avoid being a Mexican tax resident. Could the new president get around to fixing that and going to a standard, if you spend here 183 days a year, you're going to pay? Maybe. It seems like a pretty niche thing to focus on when she's talking about so much bigger priorities. Is it so important to suck a few more foreigners into the tax system? Maybe they do that. Maybe it's part of some larger bill. That's possible. So if you're living full-time in Mexico, maybe there's a risk that you'll be sucked into the tax system. The taxes are already not great. And if you get sucked into the tax system, you do have to wait generally 3 years to fully get out of it, depending on where you live. So that's not something that you want. Maybe they tighten that up. Maybe they don't. Who I think it's worse for is if you're already living there. If you're Mexican, your taxes very well may go up for all this social spending. For those folks who are already in the tax system, if you are anyone, Mexican or foreigner, who is paying taxes in Mexico, I would expect that eventually they're going to come and ask for more. I don't know that a wealth tax is perhaps on the table. I think that those don't really work that well. And I think a lot of countries have seen that, even very left-leaning ones. Income taxes could go up. New taxes could come into play. So I think most foreigners who go and live in Mexico, unless they're really embedded in the society, 365 days a year, they own a home, they're doing business locally. Most foreigners, at least the ones that I know, are not in the Mexican tax system. This won't affect them. And we'll just have to keep an eye out for new rules that might more easily suck you in if you're living there, part-time, which even then might only apply to you if you don't spend the other time in, let's say, a treaty country. So I don't see huge issues for people who live in Mexico part-time. I do see potentially big issues if you live there full-time and you are a taxpayer, again, particularly because there is a period in which case you have to kind of transition yourself out of the Mexican tax system. It is a harder tax net to get out of. What's going to happen socially? That's something that I can't predict. What happens when countries go left-wing? Would I be in a rush to buy property in Mexico? If that was my home and I wanted to have it, to some extent I look at property as, if I own it, it's a lifestyle expense. And, if I'm going to live there and I just want the property and I feel like I will continue to live there, then maybe I would. I can't give you advice on whether to buy a property, but I certainly wouldn't rule out a new vacancy tax, for example. That I don't think it's been discussed by the president-elect, but that kind of thing could come into place to talk about, hey, these foreigners are coming and buying our homes, and if they don't live there that often, hey, let's put some new kind of tax on, or let's have a property tax on foreigners, or let's raise everyone's property taxes. That's the kind of stuff that could happen. I don't necessarily see an issue with getting a residence permit. Certainly citizens are more likely to fall into the tax net than pure residents. And so if you get a residence permit with the option of converting it to citizenship, that may, be less interesting if you actually want to live in Mexico. But if you don't live in Mexico, it may not be as much of an issue. So for people who want to spend a decent chunk of time in Mexico, there's some planning to do. Otherwise, I think I would not be rushing to open a business in Mexico right now. We do hire people in a number of countries in Latin America for some reason, because I really thought Mexico was going to be fantastic. I know so many great, Mexicans. We've had much more success in Colombia, Argentina than we have in Mexico. So hiring people in Mexico, having a company, like what are the regulations around that? That might also get worse. That said, we as a professional services firm, are already paying people plenty well. I would imagine the first priority is exactly what AMLO did, which was the pandemic. During the pandemic, hey, we can't shut down people who make money from running, little, street retail. We can't put them all out of work. We can't put them all, the poverty line. And that's a big reason of why Mexico remained open during the pandemic. So, I'm not a perfect, right-wing conservative in the sense of, AMLO, whatever you want to say about it, the country stayed open during COVID. It was one of the most open places in the world. The argument was somewhat of a left-wing economic argument. But I would imagine that even, again, hiring people in Mexico, if you're hiring folks professionally and not for, factory work or something, would still be better. But does this make me slightly less interested to go and hire people in Mexico? Perhaps it does, yes, because there are good countries in Latin America where they're trending in the right direction. So not a fan of the president-elect's policies, at least most of them. By the way, listen, there's even things, that Obama did that I would agree with. Not a huge overall fan of Obama, but, to me, you can always pick something. Does that mean I like this president-elect a lot? No, I don't. I do think there's companies that are going to run in Mexico. The largest banks aren't going to go out of business. Bakeries and consumer products companies are not going to go out of business. Could it be less profitable? Maybe. And so I'll monitor it and I'll see. And maybe other country stocks will outpace my Mexican stocks, and I'll adjust accordingly. While in the meantime collecting above average dividends, which is part of what I personally do in my investment portfolio is seek yield, because I already have a growth stock. It's called my business. So I think that those are the things that you want to watch out for. Keep an eye on your stocks. If you're buying Mexican stocks, keep an eye on which ones that you think will be resilient. Plenty of resources companies. There's resources that are in high demand. What's going to happen with that? Buy what you feel comfortable with. I still believe in the country long term. I still believe in having residence permits there. I still, believe in potentially living there part-time. Keep an eye out for the tax policy. This is all the stuff that we're going to be talking to our clients about, because we read the tax journals, we read all the different publications, we see what's happening on the ground, and if things change, we'll be talking to our clients about it. So you can learn more about how we help people do that at nomadcapitalist.com/apply. We'd be happy to talk to you about whether Mexico is a plan A, plan B, plan C, plan D. Is it a residence permit? I've never said that banking in Mexico is a great option, other than maybe having a small casual bank account to pay bills. That's something that I wouldn't be in a rush to do. I've never advocated to buy Mexican real estate, and I think that those positions might remain the same. But stocks and part-time living and residence permits are all things that potentially could be part of your overall nomad capitalist mix.